Useless Monster by Mute Crows. Chapter 20, or Chapter 19. Izashi hummed softly to himself, sorting a playlist to use over the course of the next week while he swiped through notes and amended the segments of his weekly curriculum he had pulled up accordingly. The door opened to the lounge and he looked up to see Shota standing there, looking at a point on the ground before glancing over at him. The look was one Hisashi knew well, the "we need to talk now" look was one that he actually enjoyed getting because it meant Shota was ready to talk about whatever had been plaguing him for however long leading up to said look. He paused his music and stood, waving a hand in acknowledgement as Shota nodded towards All Might and headed towards one of the small tables used for the kitchenette area. All Might had been making a poor show of focused attention at his desk, thin hands wrapped loosely around a mug of probably cold tea. He leaned over and tapped the edge of All Might's computer screen on the other side of the desks. "Let's talk, yeah?" He smiled sympathetically to the older hero and made his way to where Aizawa was already seated, pulling out a chair next to him and taking a deep breath as he sat. All Might was quick to join them, tea abandoned at his desk. He sat at an angle from them, looking stiff as a kid at their first job interview. It would have been funny under different circumstances. "We need to pool our efforts. No more hiding little tidbits that don't absolutely have to be hidden. It is just going to make things more difficult for us to get this kid into a better place." Shota broke the silence while staring at the table in front of him. "Agreed." Hisashi nodded along with All Might, and Shota lightly rubbed his face with his one good hand. "All Might, you go first, since you will know the most. Repeating information is just waiting time, and we only have so long before we have to go our separate ways for class changes. If there's any confusion, we can just ask for clarification." Shota waved a prompting gesture and then settled into his seat more. Yes, of course, I will start from the beginning then. I first found Midoriya-kun under a bridge being attacked by the slime villain that had been all over the news about a year ago. He may have actually died if I had been any later than I was. When I rescued him, I had bottled up the slime and was going to leave quickly, time limited all to worry about, when he asked that I let him help me with my pain. I had never experienced interacting with a quirk that directly pinned my injuries in full. I had been avoiding those registered like ragdolls for the express purpose of keeping my injuries from the public. He pulled at them before I even got a reply, and when he started coughing up blood, I just grabbed him and took him with me. I didn't even know if it was just from him taking my pain, or if it was from the attack or something else. We talked a bit, and he was very reserved and apologetic, as he even griped at me about using my quirk and pushing my time limit now that he knew that's what it was specifically. He jumped off the roof of the building we were on, and I didn't even see him land. He was just gone, and I realized that the bottles I had put the villain in were gone as well, just before I heard the explosions. I don't know if you two saw the fight on the news, which involved me blowing away both the slime villain and, who I at the time did not know, was Midoriya-kun. I ended up breaking his arm. It was probably from him landing or being thrown against something with how he flew from the wind pressure. He ended up taking me to one of the major metro stations through an absolute maze of back streets and alleys and just vanishing into the crowd. I had managed to get his last name from him when I offered my own. Hisashi exchanged a look with Shota at the fact that All Might just threw his last name at a civilian who he had just met. Neither mentioned the slight deviance from his usual way of saying Midoriya's name either. I found him a while later, cleaning the beach at the Dagobah Park, and I just offered a better outline of how to safely train our muscles. It took a few weeks before I even got any kind of information out of him beyond surface pleasantries, but he was very obviously scared of people for someone who so badly wanted to help others at any chance he got. He tried to hide any discomforts or unease he would feel, but after so many days you start to pick up on the small things he does. The first things he shared were about his quirk. It's stronger and reaches further when he is shifted over into his bigger form. It wasn't specific, but I believe he does get scars from the injuries he takes, and he hasn't had the chance to see if they still scar other people he takes them from. He didn't know his other firm wasn't a quirk until his run-in with you two. He has been alone from a very young age. I didn't know this until after he got accepted into the school, but he hasn't seen his mother since he was 6. And no one looked for her? Hasashi interrupted, anger stirring up suddenly at the revelation. The police set the case aside because it was filed by a child who said he had a home, and they assumed it was a prank that the kid was put up to by older kids. Shota said flatly. I had been a frequent visitor at the station around the time. Which meant it was when they were both rather fresh out of graduation. It's been a while since Shota shadowed the police.
I originally thought his general behavior was just due to neglect and homelessness. I didn't really start to suspect any specific person, and finding out he was actually truly isolated was rather jarring. More alarming than that would be the history of abuse I believe may have previously happened at the hands of his former classmates, and likely one Bakugo Katsuki as well.
All Might's Jack glanced slightly as he swallowed down whatever emotional surge was building.
You're sure about that?
Shota sat up more attentively.
Or is this just you patching together things that are close enough to fit?
The intensity of Shota's gaze had Hisashi's skin prickling. This was not a light matter to begin with, but the intent Shota had meant this was something that he had also been considering prior to this conversation.
I don't have physical evidence on me, but after the entrance exams acceptance letters went out, Midoriya-kun vanished for a few days. Sure, there had previously been times where we wouldn't see each other for a while, but those times were always discussed ahead of time, and usually due to my obligations as a hero. When he did come back, his bag had been burnt to near uselessness, and he himself was obviously trying to hide the injuries he had, while also favoring practically half of his body. I didn't see them, but he wouldn't answer if he knew who hurt him or not. He has this aversion to lying if he can help it. He would rather skirt around the truth, draw attention away from the question, if he can. He doesn't like being gifted or bought things he feels undeserving of, which is a lot, so that will be something that you will need to work on too. I have had a decent amount of progress where he will at least take the items, even if I sometimes find them stuck back into my belongings later. He has some things in his bag he is incredibly protective of, and I haven't seen what they are, but I know they're in there. I won't ruin the progress I've made just to sate my curiosity on what he protects so intently.
He reached up and picked a stray hair off his shirt, only to fiddle with it in his lap.
If I was to guess, it's probably stuff from his home or family.
Hisashi nudged Shota's knee with his own under the table. He got a gentle nudge back. Shota was still feeling himself. The check-in was needed, especially with the way Hisashi's guess at what Midoriya had probably made the goggles around his neck feel a little heavier.
And you said he didn't know his other form wasn't a quirk until I used mine on him.
Shota had settled back into his previous position by now. It was definitely a point of which they all would have to become incredibly familiar with. Hisashi would have to work on his less than ideal reactions to bug-related things for this kid.
Yes, he is also incredibly anxious about anything to do with or even relating to being a tutelary omake. Oh, the principal said that was what he is. It's some kind of blessing, I guess, from the kami that was put on his family.
The principal has seen this kind of thing before? Hisashi was at a loss on how he felt about the fact that this meant there were more of what Midoriya is out there in the world. He also didn't know how he felt about the fact that this could be used as solid evidence that there were higher powers out there, but it was just in secret.
Well, he said it wasn't the exact same form, but that he had seen a few back when he was in captivity.
All Might's voice slowly trailed off as he finished his sentence. They all understood the implications. The lack of reaction from Shota just meant this was something that he at least had some knowledge of.
He's afraid of being caught and tested on by people, so he won't need to know that particular bit of information until we have him more stable.
Shota was resolute as he spoke, flexing his one hand absently.
He doesn't like lies, and that seems to include omission, but we can't. He won't be able to handle that at current.
All Might nodded in agreement.
It took a long while for me to get him comfortable enough to actually shift around me. Even then, he made it seem like it was just circumstantial. That he was, allowing me to be there for what he was going to do anyways. I have been trying to convince him that his other form was not some horrendous thing to be, that it was still him in all the good ways, just as much as he imagines that what he has long called his monster form doesn't just make his human self some atrocity. I want to say he used to shift rather frequently and almost freely before he ran into you two. I imagine that was in part out of necessity to survive as much as just trying to maneuver better in a much different body. I have and still do meet with him regularly out of school since he is so isolated otherwise. It is never for long though, as he has multiple jobs he works here and there. I have been trying to offer him an allowance of sorts, but he won't have anything to do with it.
That sounds about right, even from the little amount of time I have had with him comparatively. Shota considered his words a moment. Izashi felt like he was there more out of just emotional support at this point, but that was absolutely okay with him. He's not going to leave his partner hanging, especially when this conversation would undoubtedly end with Shota proposing his plan to invite Midoriya into their home. Alright, I'll keep my input short. Midoriya has clear signs of neglect and abuse that have broached every part of him to the point that his default reactions to everything seems to have zeroed down to guilt or fear. He has trained himself into naturally minimizing all of his impacts on any front, and feels that even asking something is asking too much of anyone. He walks silently. His presence is practically nothing. He even has gotten himself down to crying silently. Heck, I just got back from sitting in a training area with him for most of lunch, and even his shifting is silent. This information got raised eyebrows from both All Might and Izashi in response. Shota continued on without waiting. In class, he has no inputs unless directly called on, and he is mortified of that as well. His anxieties have caused a chunk of self-inflicted damage to his hands, and who knows where else, since he seems to use his quirk to grant himself. Something that needs to be broken as soon as possible, because even if he doesn't recognize it as such, it is absolutely self-harm. He is incredibly smart and observant, which is good, but also very dangerous for a mind that is convinced the world is out to get him at any given moment. He is quick to try and appeal to whoever is around him to avoid any conflicts, either because he doesn't want to be in one at all, or because he feels his opinions in the matter don't have any worth, and either way, that is another thing that will need to be addressed. Even when he is helping others, he does it from a distance, so no one can pin it to him, especially in crowds, so that it's even harder to pin it to any one person. The scowl Shota was wearing soured more and more the longer he spoke, which was not long in the first place. It was listing up something ugly in Shota, and Izashi wished he could help, but he knew that would just be something to do when they got home tonight. Shota was angry, but didn't have something specific to be angry at. They would definitely be talking again when they got home tonight. Well, I don't really have much to add myself. Midoriya is notably closed off from his classmates in a decidedly defensive way, but does have what could loosely be called a friend group. He avoids any offer they pose about hanging out outside of classes. The class overall doesn't treat him any differently outright, but if you noticeably approach him with the same caution, one shows a scared stray. I don't think he knows that he is allowed to open up to people who are friends. I don't think he has had friends before. The one time he missed lunch with you, he gestured towards All Might, he didn't eat at all.
School lunches can be expensive without waivers, and I don't think there are any on his file. It would make sense to wait until you can go somewhere you know is cheaper when you have to make every yen count.
Shota looked through All Might as he spoke.
Does he know there are waivers for these things? Recovery girl mentioned there were waivers when we were in the medical wing, so we only just learned about them,
he explained a bit sheepishly.
Well, it would help a kid who was homeless to have known about them before the year started, but that's already passed, so...
Izashi bumped Shota with his knee again. Now was a better segue than whatever way Shota was probably bumbling through his head. Shota cleared his throat softly.
I was intending to extend the room to Midoriya, so that he doesn't have to concern himself over just having a place to sleep. He's a kid. He needs a home.
Shota was minutely defensive about this, clearly expecting some kind of protectiveness on All Might's part.
Yes! I will gladly pay for any furniture you need to get for the room.
All Might sat forward sharply.
When will you be offering? I can easily cover any of his clothing and other needs. I can also be there when you set up the room if he seems too uncomfortable with the prospect, as long as you don't mind my intrusion to your home, of course.
He backpedaled a bit as he seemed to recognize who exactly he was near inviting himself into the home of. Izashi grinned as he saw the relief in the slope of Shota's shoulders.
I told him to come by the lounge after school.
Shota glanced in Hizashi's direction.
I was gonna have you go get him, since if I do it, the class will undoubtedly have a field day about it. Other than that, I was just going to directly offer. There's no point in beating around the bush for this. He needs stability and a sure source of food whenever he may be hungry. He shouldn't be working multiple jobs just to eat on top of his school life.
That sounds good to me! Hisashi was more than willing to go and get the kid that was possibly soon to be in his partner's home. He was going to be a bigger part of Midoriya's life if he accepted the offer anyway. They both looked back to All Might, who simply nodded agreement.
Then I guess we both get back to our work. Mike, I do believe you have the class starting within the minute.
All Might's tone was slightly teasing in a way that he hadn't used with the staff before. Hisashi looked at his phone and yapped as he hopped out of his seat. Man, he really needed to start setting reminders again. This happened every school year for the first few weeks. When Midoriya did show up in the lounge, he was alone. This was distantly noted, but Aizawa can imagine any number of things that could have pulled Yamada away. The vaguely lost look on Midoriya's face was quickly warping to anxiety, and Aizawa quickened his step just slightly as he walked over.
Mike was... There were a few students asking about homework.
Midoriya pulled lightly at his sleeve, pointedly not picking at his fingers from the look of it. He considered briefly moving to a different area to ask what he wanted, but after a beat he saw no point in it. It was just an offer. It wasn't any specific digging thing he was going to drag out.
Would you like to move into my home?
He was direct. Concise. Perhaps too concise, as he watched the way Midoriya practically stalled out mentally. The lost look was replaced by deep and thorough confusion. If the sudden soft intake of breath that he took after a few heartbeats was any indication, he stopped breathing for a moment too. Kayama and Sekijiro were both visibly focused on whatever was at the desk, but anyone with half a brain could tell they were listening. Leave it to those in the profession of heroics to continue to meddle in the affairs of others even when they weren't involved.
Why?
Midoriya looked at him like it was some impossible scenario that he could ever be offered a place to live. It made his frustration with the history of treatment Midoriya clearly had rile up again. Instead of letting it go anywhere, he shrugged and started to step around a student, leading him a little farther from his co-workers, but remaining in the room.
It will help improve your health and your overall education to have your basic needs assured. You can focus on your schoolwork, your social life that you have been dodging since you have to work to eat, and on yourself to start improving on your person directly. UA has a clause in its institutional legal work that sets up an allowance for a teacher to take up primary care of a student under extenuating circumstances. He explained and turned to see Midoriya close behind him, gaze focused in his direction, but not directly on him. I am capable and willing to make use of that clause and take you as a legal dependent and provide a home for you. If you would accept, of course. I have no knowledge of anyone outside of the school who may be assisting you, so if you have a place, you don't have to accept my offer. Midoriya seemed to still not be grasping that this was a legitimate option he now had available to him, looking like he was trying to put together an entirely white puzzle. Is there a problem? You'd be able to leave the home whenever you want. I'm not trying to cage you in a building, Midoriya. Aizawa frowned slightly as he tried to figure out if it was some part of his offer that was making it so difficult for Midoriya to react.
Why now?
Midoriya asked in a near whisper.
What?
No one cared before, and nothing has changed about me to make it safe. If anything, USJ just showed that I know even less about what my other form can do than I thought.
Aizawa fought down the frustrated scowl that threatened to surface. He would have to address this part of how Midoriya viewed himself first and foremost, apparently. That, and he would have to talk to Alma and Yamada about how Midoriya apparently viewed himself as an active danger to others, even without any history of violence or even bare minimum aggression toward others.
I am capable of handling more than you may think, Midoriya. I thought about this before offering, so don't think this is some impulsive offer. I just would like to give you a home to call your own. If you accept, like I said.
Aizawa reiterated. He wasn't going to force his hand, but if he was turned down, Aizawa would just start looking for other ways to provide the things Midoriya needed. They both stood in silence for a few moments, wherein Aizawa was giving Midoriya however much time he needed to consider. He was about to say that he could give him an answer tomorrow when Midoriya looked up, finally making eye contact for more than a second or so.
What day is it?
It was an unexpected question, to say the least. Aizawa couldn't even begin to pick out the relevance of it, but apparently it was important enough to Midoriya for him to ask.
Wednesday.
I will come Friday,
Midoriya said quickly, not giving Aizawa the chance to ask what the relevance of the day was, and hurried out of the lounge. His hands immediately began picking at each other the moment he wasn't facing him. He left, and Aizawa was simply standing there with a number of questions in mind. Instead of following for answers, he pulled out his phone and began typing out a message in the new group chat that was in his message history.